Welcome. So I'm Greg Schaefer. I'm the president of the American Society of International Law. And it's just an immense pleasure to host this inaugural Robert E. Dalton Roundtable on international law in government practice. We are so grateful for the Dalton family, first of all, for making this possible. And just, we value immensely the close relationship that we have with the society, with our government's lawyers, engaging in international law practice, doing just such important critical work in the world today. It's our society's mission to foster the study of international law, the understanding of international law, and to promote the establishment and maintenance of international relations on the basis of law and justice. Given all of the severe challenges that we face in the world today, from war in Ukraine to war crimes, to climate change, to refugee crises, it's just this roundtable and these participants in this roundtable are so important for our society for accomplishing this mission. So I just want to thank you for coming and being part of this, really. I want to also just thank our moderator who helped to put this together, Ed Swain. Ed is at the George Washington University Law School. He's going to moderate this panel, and he put it together. So thank you, Ed. I want to turn now to Ed's colleague, our former president and good friend, Sean Murphy. Sean is a Manat On professor at George Washington University Law School. He knew and worked with Bob Dalton, so he's going to give some words about Bob and the importance of Bob's work. Sean, he practiced at the Office of Legal Advisors in the State Department for around a decade. He was legal counselor at the U.S. Embassy in The Hague and argued cases for the International Court of Justice. He was U.S. agent at the U.S. Iran Claims Tribunal, where he also argued cases. And he was a member of the International Law Commission, which meets every summer in Geneva and issues very important reports on international law. So just, Sean, thank you for helping us to launch this new initiative and this event.
Well, thanks very much, Greg, for that very kind introduction. It really is a great pleasure to be here and to see everyone. So in 1987, as a very young lawyer, I joined the Department of State Office of the Legal Advisor, which many of you know is called L. And it wasn't long before issues started to come to me relating to the interpretation and application of treaties. And so pretty quick thereafter, I was expounding eloquently and at length on the law of treaties. And my boss said to me, and my boss is sitting in the second row here, Ron Bettauer, my boss said to me, you really need to talk to Bob Dalton, the assistant legal advisor for treaty affairs. So I took myself and my bruised ego and I trudged down to LT, the section that does treaty affairs in the Office of the Legal Advisor, where I found Bob. He was surrounded by reams of documents and information about treaties in an office located immediately adjacent to a actual vault in which dusty original copies of U.S. treaties dating back centuries were stored. So needless to say, I was rather impressed. And the more I talked to Bob that first time, but in many other times over the years, I became more and more impressed with his extraordinary depth of knowledge about the law of treaties. It's not a surprise. Here was a guy who, as an attorney in L's Office of United Nations Affairs, LUNA, had been a member of the U.S. delegation to both sessions of the Vienna Conference on the Law of Treaties, at which the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, or VCLT, was adopted. And here was a guy who thereafter wrote the seminal early article on the VCLT and what it meant, an article that he, along with Richard Kearney, aptly titled The Treaty on Treaties, a piece that was published in the American Journal of International Law in 1970. So during my time in the department, Bob was the go-to guy for anything on the law of treaties. And I know that many others who passed through L during Bob's time would say much the same. There are other aspects of Bob that may be less well known. He grew up in Westborough, Massachusetts. He graduated from the College of Holy Cross in 1953. He received his law degree from Columbia Law School in 1956. He served as a captain in the United States Air Force. He was a longstanding member of the American Society of International Law, a host for this roundtable. He had a first-class mind, ranging well beyond interests in just the law. He devoured the Wall Street Journal, as far as I could tell. He delighted in Dutch still life paintings. He enjoyed traveling abroad. Indeed, he was an enthusiastic member of the Cosmos Club, which is just down the block from here. He was a competitive swimmer. He was a runner, competing in marathons well into his 50s. Indeed, I occasionally would be walking along the street here in Washington, D.C., and Bob would run on by, saying somewhat formally in his rather deep voice, "Hello, Sean," as he passed. He stayed in excellent shape, perhaps in part because he walked a mile every day to and from the office to where he lived. Though himself not married or with children, he had a rich family life with his brothers, in-laws, nieces, and nephews, located mostly in Massachusetts, but also elsewhere, such as in Texas and even as far as Japan. Though through Bob's family, ASIL has been honored to create both a book prize and this roundtable in Bob's memory. This roundtable is about international law in government practice. It's aptly named after a man who started his career at the Department of State in 1961 and remained there for almost 60 years, 6 decades, until his death in 2019 at the age of 87. For those in our field who knew him, he is sorely missed.
Thank you, Sean, for those touching remarks about Bob Dalton. It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, and that is Brian Egan. Brian served as legal advisor at the U.S. Department of State from 2016 to 2017. He also was a top lawyer at the National Security Council and served as Deputy White House Counsel to President Obama and Assistant General Counsel at the Department of the Treasury. He currently is a partner at Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher Flom, where he practices in the areas of national security, CFIUS on foreign investment, and international trade. Brian is also a counselor of the American Society of International Law and an important participant in many of our committees. Please join me in welcoming Brian. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks so much, Greg, for the introduction. And thanks to everyone for coming out today. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be here in person with you all. This is the 5th in-person event at ASIL since the pandemic. So we're still counting on one hand at the inaugural roundtable. I'm not going to speak for too long. I want to get to the roundtable. I have one story to begin with about Bob Dalton myself, though, who was a truly gracious and wise man and lawyer. I got to know Bob towards the end of his career. In fact, one of my first days as legal advisor in 2016, when Bob was senior advisor on treaty practice, Bob and I met to discuss a paper that Bob had written on treaty practice and interpretation in the United States. So Bob had asked me for this meeting, and in his unassuming and modest way, I figured out pretty quickly it was because he was worried that I actually didn't have a clue about treaty interpretation and practice in the United States. So I asked Bob, Bob, can I read this paper in advance of our meeting? And Bob gently assured me that that would not be necessary for this meeting. It was only once we met that I realized the paper that Bob had written was in fact a 3-volume, multi-100-page treatise on U.S. contemporary treaty practice that no one in the world, literally except Bob, could have written. And I suspect that many of my former colleagues, some of whom are in the room today, probably still use that paper as a reference for many issues today. Similar documents, though, I think could have been written and similar stories told by many of our government's finest public servants who have devoted their careers to promoting and developing international law as part of their government practice. And I'm going to spend most of my remarks talking to those of you in the audience who are thinking about pursuing a career in government service in international law. I commend you for this interest, and I urge you to consider a career in government. This is not a walk in the park, but it's because there's no better place, in my humble opinion, to practice international law than in the US government. I think this practice can be challenging, exciting, and fulfilling, and let me say a few words about each. First, the practice is definitely challenging. You will encounter clients or policymakers who discount or ignore or even scoff at the idea that the US should even care about international law. That's just a day in the life of an L lawyer. You may face a member of Congress, just as Bob Dalton did, who expresses skepticism that the US should join any treaty whatsoever. You may encounter foreign governments, or even from allied countries or non-government or organizational advocates who are openly hostile to US positions on customary international law, maybe some with reason. So challenging, exciting. Exciting because you as a US government representative, again, in my humble opinion, are at the forefront of efforts to identify and develop international law. Academic experts and NGOs and international organizations can write about international law. And we private practitioners can argue about international law, but only governments have the power, and I would say the responsibility to create international law. And for all of our warts as a country here, the United States continues to carry a substantial power and responsibility in this space. So finally, practicing international law in US government is fulfilling because you're engaged in true public service on behalf of our country to serve a greater good, the development of rules of the road for every area of life that will be of vital importance to our future generations, both here and abroad. Now, let me turn to say a few words about the office that you'll be hearing from in a moment. The office that Harold Koh has famously described as the world's greatest international law firm, and that's the State Department's Office of Legal Advisor, or L. While L is not the only office in the US government that thinks about or practices international law, there's no question that attorneys in this office are the government's heartbeat and I would say conscience on international law. You're going to hear today or tonight from some of L's very bright and best up-and-coming lawyers, some veteran lawyers who bring a variety of experiences and perspectives to the table. What makes L and L lawyers unique? Well, there have literally been law review articles written on this topic, so I won't top them here, but I'm going to focus on 3 items. First is the breadth of the L experience, which you're going to hear about in a moment. You will never get bored working in L because you will never stop learning when working in L. Much like the Foreign Service, L has a long tradition of rotating its lawyers through the over 20 offices that comprise L. The variety of these experiences cannot be matched in any other legal job. I'm confident of this. You could travel through international law related to extradition, human rights, sovereign immunity, or private international law. You could work on domestic law issues like government contracts, employment law, or my first rotation in L, the Freedom of Information Act. You could represent the United States in arbitration or in domestic or international litigation. And this is in a time when there's an increasing drive for lawyers, particularly in private practice, to be uber specialized. The breadth of the L experience just can't be matched. Second is L's approach to legal analysis and problem solving. L has a culture of collaboration that I really don't think is replicated anywhere else in the federal government. L lawyers work together across L offices to solve problems every day. When I was a legal advisor to the National Security Council at the White House, I knew that if I wanted a well-developed, well-rounded legal paper, top rate to address a foreign policy or national security crisis, I could count on L to pull together a product reflecting many different office views and many perspectives. L's collaborative approach to analysis and problem solving actually makes L a fun place to work as well. Third and finally is the training and tools that you will receive and develop as an L lawyer. You will learn to negotiate. Perhaps most importantly, you will learn to negotiate with other agencies in the US government, which is often more harder than negotiating with foreign governments. You will learn to write in all manner of forms, from draft treaties and agreements to legal briefs, to emails and talking points, to elegant and sometimes not so elegant edits, to memoranda to the so-called seventh floor of the State Department. You will learn to analyze US statutes and case law, UN and other IO materials, international legal materials, and hopefully treatises and historical information on US precedent and practice that were developed by people like Bob Dalton. Now, these skills will serve you well in your future. As you will hear and see, you can make a great career at L. L is one of the very few government legal offices where almost everyone is a career civil servant, and the office is led by L veterans. You'll be drawn to some of the most high priority foreign policy and national security issues, and your clients at the State Department will welcome your collaboration and participation in most cases. But you can also do many, many other things with your L experience. The list of positions held today by my former colleagues at L is remarkable. And again, I would say singularly unique amongst US government offices. L alumni in the Academy, one of you just heard from today, are some of the brightest stars in international law around the country. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. L alumni hold or have held recently senior positions in the legal counsel offices of the Departments of Defense, Treasury, Homeland Security, U.S. Trade Representative, the intelligence community, the Consumer Financial Protection Board, among others. L alumni have served in senior policy positions in the State Department and ambassadorships. L alumni have served as key staff on Capitol Hill and in international organizations and NGOs. One of our most famous L alumni is the current U.S. Director of National Intelligence. And L alum are some of my favorite colleagues in private practice where I am today. Almost invariably, I know that when I speak with an L alumni at another law firm, I will find a colleague that is well-spoken and well-researched, even if we are on opposite sides of the issue. So in short, L lawyers have taken many paths in their careers, frequently influenced by their positions and experiences within L. So if you're a new or newish lawyer or law student with an interest or passion in international law and international legal issues, you should seriously consider L. Do not be deterred by the application process, by the security clearance requirements, by the forms, the commute to Foggy Bottom, or anything else. Also, do not allow yourself to think that only one type of lawyer can succeed at L. L needs diversity. They need diversity of all types. They need creative, passionate lawyers from all interests and background. They need you. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to the roundtable and to speaking with you all further. Thank you.
We have sign-up sheets for L. Thank you, Brian. There's wonderful remarks as always. And if the young folks in the audience were not inspired, you cannot be inspired. I know Brian and many of the other speakers will stay with us for the remainder of this program. We've got a lovely reception to follow, and you'll have a chance to inquire further. Thank you. Inquire further of them about what it's like to devote yourself to public service in international law. Before we move to the panel, I'd like to take a moment to thank several people for their role in creating tonight's event. First, I'd like to express our deepest thanks to the Dalton family. who've provided such generous support for this initiative. On behalf of the family, Bob's niece, Colleen Dalton, expressed the hope that, and these are her words, the Roundtable, together with the book award established in 2020, will celebrate Bob's love of the law, his appreciation of excellence, his commitment to service, and his hope in a new generation of international lawyers. A few days ago, Colleen had an opportunity to look at the program for this evening, and although she's unable to be with us in person, she wrote that the Roundtable is an event that I believe my uncle would be excited to join. I hope it's a success in the eyes of all of those who participate. I think those of us who knew Bob would agree that he would really have been in his element this evening. I'd like to thank Professor Murphy, who spoke so eloquently about Bob a few minutes ago. When he was president of the society, Sean worked closely with me and with Bob's family to commemorate him in a way that reflects his values and those of the society. In a moment, I'll introduce our inaugural convener, Ed Swain, who chaired the planning group and will moderate the panel. But first, I'd like to recognize the other members of the planning group, some of whom are with us today. Kate Garove, Kathleen Hook, Rebecca Ingber, and Darren Johnson. Please join me in thanking Ed and all of his colleagues. I don't know if Kate is here. Kate, are you present? There you are. Great. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do have to say how much we appreciated your raising this possibility with us shortly after Bob's death, that his family might well wish to commemorate his life and service through a gift to the society, which is, of course, exactly what they decided to do. Finally, I'd like to thank the ASIL staff, and especially Wes Rist and Taylor Kilpatrick, who oversaw the organization of this event. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our convener, Edward Swain, who is the Charles Kennedy Poe Research Professor at the George Washington University Law School. He is a distinguished scholar of foreign relations law who served as counselor on international law at the Department of State. Like Brian, Ed is also a counselor of the society. We have lots of counselors, and we're very proud of every one of them. So welcome, Ed, and please introduce our panel. Sure, thank you.
So, thank you so much for that. So, I'm just, thank you very much. Ooh, a little too close, perhaps. I'll leave that back. I'm really delighted to be here today. I was honored to be asked to be involved in this enterprise, not only because it's hosted by the American Society of International Law, which I've enjoyed many events here in Tillar House, and not only because it features astonishing and exceptional alumni such as Sean and Brian, and present members of that office, but also because it's the first roundtable in honor of Bob Dalton, with whom many of us had the great pleasure of working. Bob was, as you've heard, and forgive me for going back over this ground slightly, Bob was an extraordinary public service and a servant and a friend of many of us who had the pleasure of working with him. He was synonymous with the treaty office and with treaties. And honestly, it was mentioned that he worked next to the treaty vault, but I kind of regarded him as the treaty vault as well. He was really the personification of that office and that project in a way not unlike when I was describing him to someone else. Let me just say this. I won't take no position on the likeness, but I was describing the length of his service and the extraordinary quality of the work he gave to the nation. And somebody said, "Oh, like Anthony Fauci," was essentially, and he really stood and represented the good works of the United States government and of Elle in a way that was very impressive. As a pivot from that a little bit, we've had today here people who not only represent the work, some work within treaties, but also I think the full breadth of the Elle experience. And that was something that Bob himself did. We think of him as being associated with the treaty office, but as I mentioned, he worked in UN affairs at the passport office as well, and was in his own way a benefit of the breadth of the Elle experience. But we're so grateful to be joined today here with a number of members of that office who span work from the Office of Political Military Affairs, Trent Blott here, Charla Dremel, who is with the Office for Private International Law. Forgive me, by the way, if I miss your most recent affiliations. It's always possible. That's one of the benefits of the rotation system is you never quite know the present affiliation of those you're speaking with. Katie King with Non-Proliferation, is that correct? And Arms Control. And Dorothy Patton with Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. Is that correct? And Shubha Sastry, Assistant Legal Advisor with the Office of Economic and Business Affairs. So we're really grateful to have them all here today. And I have to say, I was thanked earlier for convening this. This was the easiest thing to convene. When I mentioned that it was being done at ASIL and being done in honor of Bob Dalton, everyone immediately said, yes, how can I help? The easiest thing. And I think that's a testament to Bob's career and his service, and also the enthusiasm and public interest of those who work at Elle. So with that, I want to go through each of you, if you don't mind, and ask you, Seriatim, what brought you to Elle? What path led you to your present situation? So Katie, if you don't mind starting.
Sure, happy to. I came to Elle pretty easily in the sense that I knew exactly what I wanted, and less easily in the way that it took me to get here. I went to undergrad knowing I wanted to do something in the foreign affairs space, and it took me a little longer to figure out that law was the right way to do that. And so after some years wandering in the wilderness, I went back to law school and decided that I was going to definitely go the public service, public interest route, find my connection to foreign relations, international policy, how I could. And so, of course, when you're thinking about that, you have to think about the State Department. Managed to get an internship with Elle and was completely blown away by the quality of the people that I got to work with there. Everyone I saw was just really, really a walking advertisement for working at Elle. And so when the internship ended, I seriously contemplated handcuffing myself to a desk, but instead managed to convince them to hire me straight out of law school. So once I graduated, I came back to work at Elle as an attorney advisor.
So I'll be next. I think I'm here to be the person who had the unusual path to Elle. Mainly, so I also, like Katie, was an intern during law school. International law was my passion, but I didn't know if I wanted to actually practice law, because I also interned at our Office of War Crimes Issues of the State Department, then called SWCI, and now called the Office of Global Criminal Justice. And so I had one foot in law and one foot in policy. So eventually, after doing a couple other things after law school, I became a presidential management fellow, which let me do both policy, and then I was able to come back to Elle as an attorney on detail in our Office of United Nations Affairs. After seeing work at both the Pentagon, DHS, and Department of State over that fellowship, Elle was by far the best place I worked, and I made sure I got back there.
That's great.
Thanks. My path was a little unusual. All of the students in the room who are already thinking about international law have a leg up on me because I did not have Elle on my radar at all for a very long time. I graduated from law school and went straight to a firm, did transactional work that wasn't super exciting. And we moved to DC. I went to work on Capitol Hill. I left the law altogether and did press for a while, which was a great experience. But again, not quite my cup of tea. Then I went to another federal agency, the Federal Trade Commission, where I did consumer protection work. And then I had the great fortune of being the trailing spouse to my husband, who is in the audience. He too does international work for the federal government, so you can also pick his brain. He became the attaché at the embassy in London. And that experience just opened my eyes to all that the State Department does. It was truly amazing to see in every sector, in trade, in human rights, in aviation, in law enforcement, which is what Jason was doing, agriculture, you name it. It was just inspiring to see all that our government does in these posts around the world. So when we came back, I said, I'd like to do that. And I had the great fortune of joining Elle at that point. So there I am.
So I think we're largely describing how people get to Elle, but I will also put in an endorsement for being a trailing spouse. I have twice done it through 2 overseas tours, and there's a lot to be said for it. So I'll put in a pitch for that as well. Charlotte?
Yeah, my husband would also endorse the trailing spouse life. He was a big fan. Yes. So I also came to Elle right out of law school. Having gone to law school with sort of the express goal of coming to Elle, blissfully unaware that that was really kind of a long shot goal at the time. I had, after college, gone and done an MPA and worked as an international affairs and trade analyst at the GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office. And I really enjoyed that work. It was a great place to work. If you're not necessarily in law or wondering about it, I also endorse that that office. They do a lot of really interesting work there. In the course of that work, I did obviously intersect with the State Department because international affairs and trade. And while doing some investigations, I worked with State Department and also learned about the Office of the Legal Advisor. I had been interested in the law. I think many people who do policy are. They go hand in hand a little bit. And while I was doing my MPA at Columbia, I had taken a trade law class at the law school there. So it was, it's something I had always thought about. But learning about Elle while at the GAO sort of sparked that maybe that's what I could do if I became a lawyer. Because I had been interested in law, but not really sure what I would want to do with it. That had been the missing link. And learning about Elle sort of closed that loop for me. So I went to law school and was wildly fortunate that it all worked out. I was at Berkeley. That happened to be one of the schools where they did on-campus recruiting. And I got a summer internship. Same thing, had an amazing experience, thought, yep, I was right. And I remember that the hiring processes in government are always a little bit challenging. And you can only hold on to so many offers, and there's a whole time frame, and the firms cut you off after. And I had a firm offer, but I didn't want it. It was a lovely place, but it's just not what I wanted to do. And Elle had still just sort of not managed to gather everyone in a room to make their decisions. And so I finally called them and I said, you have to tell me by tomorrow. I'm out of time. You must let me know. And they said, oh, we're meeting this afternoon. Just wait. And I just literally sat on my bed in my room for like 4 hours, waiting for the phone to ring. But it worked out. And that was over 15 years ago, and it's been great. So.
For those of us that have served on the recruitment. So backing up, thanks. Backing up a little bit, I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service for undergrad, which others here may be familiar with given where we are. And so in some ways, Elle seems like the obvious place for me, but I nevertheless took a somewhat meandering route here. I went to law school immediately after college. And then I went to a law firm. I don't think I was particularly thoughtful about kind of what path I was going to, but the law firms make it easy. They come to campus. And so I went to a law firm. I went to Hogan Lovells, which used to be Hogan and Hartson. And I was in their trade group. I had, I would say, a really positive experience at the firm. I got good experience there, good work. And I wasn't really sort of thinking about moving, but one of the partners that I worked with became the general counsel at USTR, at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and planted this seed about working in government and public service. And I was fortunate there to have lots of really excellent mentors, including ones who said, one partner said, Shiva, the only elevator going up is not the elevator here at the firm. Like people who had done government service who encouraged me to kind of think about these options. And so I applied to USTR, and I was fortunate to get that position. And I tortured myself about whether to make a change at that time, but really never have looked back and have really loved government service and government work. And I, at USTR, I was in the general counsel's office for 4 years, and I primarily did a lot of WTO dispute settlement work, a lot of litigation. I also had policy portfolio where I advised policy clients, but much of my litigation work was pretty intensive. And so it would take up kind of a lot of my bandwidth. And that was a really good, different, but also fulfilling way to practice international law, and was really a great experience. But I found at the end of 4 years that I was the dispute settlement work it's really intensive. And so I needed to kind of slow down a little bit. I took a policy job at USTR in their multilateral affairs office. I worked on trade and development issues kind of in the WTO, more in the negotiating framework. I did that for 2 years. I found that I wanted to get back to practicing law, but I wanted to stay in international affairs. That's where my interest was. So L made a lot of sense. There was a former colleague who had also come over from USTR who was pretty positive about L. So I applied and was also fortunate to get a position at L. And so I've been here for a number of years since then.
So this is really helpful, and I hope kind of illustrates the fact that while one can look at people who are presently in the legal advisor's office and sort of think, well, they went to this law school and here they are at L, there are really diverse paths that lead one there, and everyone's life story is a lot more complicated, and it can take twists and turns that no one exactly expected at the beginning, even if it was in one's mind eye. What I want to do also now, if you don't mind, is shift to the question of the diversity of work at L. And perhaps we can proceed in reverse order, if that's okay, to kind of describe some of the variety of work that you've done or are currently doing at L.
Sure. So I started in LEB in an extraordinary stroke of luck. It's not a typical first rotation, but I was doing economic sanctions and sovereign debt issues, which were really a lot of fun. I think for a while I had Brian Egan's old phone number and in that office. And I first had a range of sanctions portfolios, counterterrorism sanctions, Burma, North Korea, a number of them. And then I moved into the Iran sanctions portfolio around the time that we were negotiating the nuclear deal with Iran. So that was a really exciting and fun opportunity to work on, something very very important to the United States foreign policy, something really aimed at, international peace, and also really exciting and kind of fun legal issues. I was on the sanctions side, so working very closely with Treasury legal colleagues. We were kind of helping the negotiators and policymakers kind of identify the scope of the sanctions relief commitments that they could consider taking on in the context of that deal. And so that was very, very fulfilling work at the time. And then I was there for a couple of years, and then I rotated to the Human Rights and Refugees Office. And I did the Women's International Human Rights portfolio and the Refugee Admissions portfolio, two pretty distinct areas. The Refugee Admissions portfolio is also all really U.S. law. It's our law governing our admissions program, and the Human Rights portfolio was more international law, two completely different sets of clients. So that was a really good experience to see both of those things. I did that for a year. I was planning to stay, longer, but I then went on detail to the National Security Council legal office. And there was handling a wide range of issues, but relying heavily on government subject matter experts throughout the government to kind of help with the policy process. It was an interesting time. It was the end of 2016 and beginning of 2017. And then I got cut a little bit short because I had my son. And so I was on maternity leave for a while, came back to L. And then I was in the Claims and Investment Disputes Office. So I was also really fortunate in terms of the type of work I was able to get exposed to there. I did litigation at the Iran U.S. Claims Tribunal and also at the ICJ. We had 2 cases that Iran had filed against the United States that were going on at that time under an old treaty of amity that we had with Iran. And so both of those were really good opportunities again to do. And it was interesting having done state-to-state dispute settlement at USTR to do it in at the WTO, to do it now in a completely different setting. So that was a really good I enjoyed building on some of that prior experience, but learning a new forum and a kind of a different way of doing it. Then I was promoted to assistant legal advisor in 2019 for the Office of Private International Law. So Charlotte and I got to work together, which was a lot of fun and a lot more multilateral negotiating experience and just a lot of and really kind of actually pushing a little bit on my on sort of a different type of skill set, I would say, in LPIL, where you're working with private sector experts and academics to help inform U.S. positions, where you're really kind of, for someone who's a little bit introverted, like the full day of kind of reaching out to multiple delegations to kind of get advice, I would be like pretty tired at the end of the day, but I learned a lot and I think developed some additional skills there and had a really great team. And then earlier this year, the assistant legal advisor for this office that I've come back to LEB where I started and have taken over the assistant legal advisor position there from the attorney who has now left on detail. So handling kind of a really wide range of issues, from sanctions, trade and investment sanctions, and then aviation and telecom, things I'm really getting to learn as I get into the job more and more. So it's been a really challenging experience, and it's been really fun. It's more crisis driven than the private international law world, which is a lot of long-term projects and kind of you really own your own projects and have flexibility. And here, it's a lot of stuff coming at us, and we're trying to react as best we can in the timeframes that policymakers want. And so it's a little bit of a different dynamic, but has been a really fun and it's been a fairly busy time, I would say. Plenty of crises to go around.
So I'll just highlight a couple of experiences that I've had while in L. I've been in a number of different offices, and I'll mention a couple of them that maybe won't be mentioned by others. One is I worked in the Office of Legislation and Foreign Assistance. And that is a really interesting office that people, I think, sometimes don't necessarily appreciate because it really is domestic law. It's not an international law office. I think it's important to understand that in the legal advisor's office, we're sort of general counsel. So we do all of the stuff, FOIA and, employment and everything else, including treaties and non-proliferation. So the Foreign Assistance Office is domestic law dealing with, appropriations and the use of money, which is really kind of fascinating. It gives you an opportunity to see priorities based on where we spend our money and how we make policy decisions about what we want to sort of promote in the world. And I really enjoyed that office a lot. It was a fascinating experience to be supportive of our foreign assistance programming. I was, for instance, for a couple of years, the primary counsel for PEPFAR, which is our HIV/AIDS assistance program. In that time, I would have weekly meetings with Deborah Birx, who you may have subsequently heard of. I got to work with really amazing public health policy clients who were just tremendously committed to their work and to their goals of eradicating HIV/AIDS around the world. So that was an inspiring office to work in, though obviously not international law. It was very much international policy. I also was really fortunate to be, like Professor Murphy, the legal counselor at the U.S. Embassy in The Hague. So I was there from 2015 to 2018. And that's a great experience. As I mentioned, my husband also agreed on the trailing spouse. Enjoyed that. I think what's really fascinating about serving as in an embassy is you are bridging the diplomat lawyer divide. I mean, all of us still are diplomats in some way, but we're more lawyers. And there, you're sort of more diplomats. You're getting a lot of your legal advice from your colleagues in L. There, when issues come up, you go back to DC and say, just want to make sure, is this okay? And what you're doing is making all of the relationships with the sort of legal community. The Hague, obviously, as I'm sure you're aware, is a center for international law with all of the international courts and institutions, the Hague Conference on Private International Law. So there's a lot that happens there in the world of international law. So there is a large and sort of robust diplomatic legal community that represents the various governments of the world at all of these institutions on everything from what's their budget going to be this year, and do they need new staff rules, to how are we going to handle cases at the ICJ and disputes. One of the first things that happened when I arrived was Kosovo and then Palestinians both submitted articles of accession to a treaty in The Hague, and that went well. And so I had amazing legal support from the Office of the Legal Advisor, the treaty office in particular. Our treaty office is really a force to be reckoned with. Our treaty analyst was able to go into that famed vault and pull out decisions that this body had made in the 1950s and 60s during the Cold War, that were sort of formal decisions of the body about who could exceed and who could not. It was tremendous. We had so much great legal information, and literally nobody else had any of this. Unfortunately, they also didn't care. We tried our best, but it was a very, very instructive experience in sometimes the challenge when highly politicized issues meet kind of more classic law. And I learned a lot in that experience, and really, it was just fascinating. My current office, Private International Law, is an area that I should have mentioned. We do a lot of long-term projects at UNCITRAL, which is the UN Commission on International Trade Law, Hague Conference, and UNIDROIT. I work on family law treaties at the Hague Conference, as well as a couple of different issues at UNCITRAL, and most recently was able to serve as the U.S. representative to negotiate a maritime treaty at UNCITRAL. It's a pretty narrow issue. So there's a lot of treaties out there that, the big ones get all the press, but there's actually tons of highly specialized treaties that really govern relations in a lot of different areas of commerce and kind of private interactions. So this one we finished up. It's at the General Assembly now for approval. We'll see. And it was a really interesting experience negotiating a treaty, particularly through COVID. A lot of it was done remotely. That was challenging. Trying to get people to move off of positions and really negotiate solutions. There's a joke that at the UN, they don't like to tell you you're taking coffee breaks because people think, oh, diplomats, they're just always taking coffee breaks. But actually, that's where so much work gets done. They're hugely important. We could not function without coffee breaks. That is where, people pass things back and forth and try to convince you to change your mind on this or that. So Zoom coffee breaks, less compelling. It was really hard to move the needle sometimes, but we did nonetheless finish up, thankfully having some in-person sessions that were really vital to completion. So that was a really great experience as well. And
Congratulations.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
So it's wonderful to hear about what you guys are doing. Really good stuff. I started in LM, the same office Brian must have been in. Every federal agency will have a function, a management function that keeps the lights on and pays for travel. And there's a lot of travel at the State Department. I had the travel portfolio. All of how we travel is regulated by law. So if you read about the travel practices of a cabinet member, something went wrong with that one. I had the travel portfolio, I had the Privacy Act, government, the public-private partnerships, the GCCA. Then I moved on to LCA, here's the alphabet soup, LCA for Consular Affairs, where our clients were the consular officers in 250 posts across the world and in our passport issuance offices. We see everything there, all passports and visas. And I had, in particular, the TRIG portfolio, which is the terrorism-related inadmissibility grounds. There are several grounds under which you can't get a visa. That's one of them. And I also kept the confidentiality of our visa records. Lots of people want visa records, like angry ex-spouses, the press, Hollywood, members of Congress. So legal questions arise in that space quite a bit as well. I moved on then to a regional office, which hasn't been discussed yet. In L, we have functional offices and we have regional offices. I was in the regional office for South and Central Asia. So it's fundamentally different from a functional office in that instead of living in a treaty or a law or even a legal concept, you're embedded in a place. So Afghanistan, I know we have some Afghan colleagues here. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bhutan were my specialty countries, but the regional offices tend to be smaller than the others, so we kind of work quite closely together. Katie came after me in that office. And it was an amazing experience. I'm a geography geek at heart, so really enjoyed learning about a part of the world that I didn't know a lot about. It feels very much like a general counsel in that I see all of the military and the foreign assistance and the human rights and the climate and the diplomatic law issues. And I'm relying on my L colleagues to help me, string together the right answer for the post, so to speak, or the assistant secretary for the bureau. And then I moved to my current rotation, which is public diplomacy and public affairs, which is, again, very, very different. My clients now are in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. So all of those wonderful exchange programs that you hear about, it's really a leg of our foreign policy, those people-to-people exchanges that we firmly believe make all of the difference. They're all allowed under the Fulbright-Hays Act from 1961, the year that Bob Dalton joined the department. I love that. And so the Fulbright scholars come under that. The Fulbright program is one of our flagship programs. And I love this statistic, 1 out of 3 heads of state or heads of government was in the Fulbright program. It has a tremendous reach. But also we have au pairs, we have students, teachers, professors, government visitors. It's just, it really brings, the whole point is to bring people together to promote mutual understanding. So it's something we feel very good about. And that's where I'm at. That's it.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly talk about the office I'm currently in to do some what might be considered classic international law and some surprises to me. So I currently cover the law of war in our Office of Political Military Affairs. So some classical things I cover tend to be like use of force, self-defense, although some other colleagues work on them more closely, but I have had written memos about Article 2.4, the UN Charter, Article 51 of the UN Charter. So what you might think of as pure international law. And then some things that surprised me was coming in, I covered detention, so I covered Guantanamo. And in doing so, I review US legal positions in court. Department of Justice files on behalf of the US government, but in consultation with agencies. So I review, I've lost count of the number of district court briefs I reviewed, the things going to the DC Circuit, including an en banc case last year and one for the Supreme Court last year, all related to habeas and Guantanamo detention and the law of war detention. But fascinating law of war issues in domestic court. So everything from when does a non-international armed conflict end to does the due process clause of the US Constitution apply at Guantanamo, all sorts of legal issues to be thinking through so we can properly agree on a position the US takes in court.
Involving, I suppose, a fair amount of cross-town traffic with DOJ.
It is a lot, I would say, interagency coordination at its highest. Communicating with the Department of Justice, Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and then all coordinated through the National Security Council.
So Katie, I don't know if would you like to speak a little bit maybe to like your experience in the front office? Would that be?
Sure. Yeah, especially since somehow, in a true demonstration of how collaborative L is and how great the rotation system is, many of my previous jobs have already been discussed. But one thing that hasn't come up is my tenure as the L Special Assistant. So as has been mentioned, L is largely staffed by career attorneys. And we have offices that each have a different focus. And then overseeing all of those, we have 4 deputy legal advisors and then a legal advisor who is notionally a Senate confirmed position.
That cuts deep.
And when that position is not so filled, normally we have our career principal deputy legal advisor who steps in and fills that role. So in the mix of all of that, plus people serving in the counselor role that's been mentioned before, you also have an attorney advisor who gets pulled up to temporarily serve as a special assistant in the front office. And what you do there really varies. Sometimes it is working to make sure that a newsletter that comes up to the front office to express to DOJ what our position should be in litigation gets signed out in a way that both represents fairly accurately the State Department's position and also does not have DOJ screaming at us and saying, where is this letter? We dated it 5 hours ago. We need to file this in court. Sometimes it's working to prepare for litigation. If the legal advisor is going to go give remarks in front of an international tribunal, you need to help prepare with that. Other times it's getting ready for the regular interagency meetings that happen between lawyers, which Brian is very well familiar with from both sides, in terms of how the National Security Council gathers together lawyers from Department of State, Department of Justice, DOD, other agencies as appropriate, to really work through the most pressing legal issues of the day. And so you're helping gather together, again, the information for that, participating in those meetings, watching how legal decisions get made and how that feeds into the policy process. It's an absolutely fascinating opportunity and really a confirmation of how special L is, because as with those regional attorney positions Dorothy was talking about, you're not the expert in any one thing. You are relying on your colleagues having done the work and gotten it in front of you. And it's really unfailingly true that the work that comes up to the front office from the attorney advisors is of remarkable quality. So the special assistant position is interesting in that it's always a little nebulous what you're doing. Sometimes, again, it is staying late to help negotiate or to help put in place the foundations for negotiating treaties so we can help relocate Afghans to the United States. And other times it is knowing what the legal advisor's favorite snack is so that you can get him something that's going to let him stay this final few hours.
So, Katie, you and Dorothy and others have mentioned not only the fascinating things that each of these offices are engaged with, but also the fact that there's a lot of coordination, obviously between the regional and the functional offices. But I know that very often the kind of things that hit the headlines require coordination among a number of different offices. So you may not all wish to speak to this kind of question, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. I was curious if you could say something about coordinating on a contemporary international problem like those posed by Ukraine. For example, like the different offices, how you've seen those engage. And not to pick on anyone in particular, but Trent, would you mind leading off on this?
Sure, I can try. So just some, I guess I could say some examples of how we tackled Ukraine. And I just have to say, like, the number of lawyers I've seen work on one issue, this is probably the most. Like, I've even established a standing meeting, and like I think nearly every L office is represented there because we were all working on Ukraine issues at one point or another. For an example, early on their full-scale invasion, Russia's full-scale invasion started on February 24th, and the attorney who covers Russia for the law of war and Ukraine, and also happens to cover war crimes, was in Geneva negotiating something else. So it fell to me for the initial week or so of the full-scale invasion to figure out what to call these things, because our policy clients, like the secretary and our ambassador at the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, really wanted to call out Russia for its bad acts. But how we described those, we needed to be correct in how we did that. So I did the initial war crimes analysis for the US government, from gathering the information to doing the legal assessment, that then went to interagency lawyers at the Pentagon, the NSC, all around to then drafting the secretary's statement announcing that we had assessed there to be war crimes committed by Russia's forces, and then practicing with the spokesperson who was going to announce it. He was worried about legal questions being posed to him. And so I went with him to the podium and practiced back and forth of how to answer legal questions, or mainly avoid answering. So just that was by far the busiest time in L. But I'm really happy to be able to work on it, and then also happy that that attorney came back.
Do others wish to speak to your engagement?
Sure. So I would. Our office has had. I would say an example of where several different portfolios have at different times been engaged in the office since the invasion. And so it's been really pretty busy and interesting to see kind of the ways in which it touches on different legal issues, some of which, we expected sanctions to be an issue sort of as we were seeing this coming down the pike, but other issues come up over time. So with respect to sanctions, there was a lot of work preparing for the invasion and also being prepared to act quickly should it occur. There were sanctions authorities kind of already in place that allowed us to impose sanctions quite rapidly once the invasion occurred. But there's also been the development of new sanctions authorities since the invasion to allow us to target additional activities and additional actors. And so that was a lot of the things that I'll describe involved a lot of interagency legal coordination. And so on the sanctions, we work very closely with Treasury colleagues. When it comes to the development of a new executive order to provide a new sanctions authority, we're working closely with Treasury, but also with NSC colleagues and also with DOJ, who is, looking at things sort of from a little bit of a different lens. And so, a lot of that work was done kind of very quickly, trying to put in place new authorities as there was a policy demand to respond to the situation on the ground in that way. So that has been really interesting. There are also separate from executive orders, there are now in the sanctions world a plethora of statutory sanctions, many of which are mandatory. So requiring the imposition of sanctions under certain circumstances, and that involves that presents a different set of issues for policymakers, because oftentimes they don't have the flexibility to just use that tool as they wish and calibrate. The statute may be requiring them to do certain things, but then they have to anticipate what the sort of consequences of that are going to be and how they want to address those consequences. So we sometimes help also with that in understanding the contours of the statute and what their options are. And then, as you will recall, early on after the invasion, there was a policy decision to close our airspace to Russian airlines, and and since our office has the international aviation portfolio, we were helping advise clients on some of the legal considerations related to that. And the attorney who has the lead on this, who did a fabulous job kind of responding very quickly to NSC and policy client questions on that, was coordinating very closely with FAA and Department of Transportation lawyers also to make sure we're all on the same page. It implicates both some international law questions and also some domestic law questions. And then finally, there were also, you may recall early on, there were in international forums calls for sovereign debt relief for Ukraine as a way to provide some support to Ukraine. And so our office doing the sovereign debt portfolio was also involved on that. And then in addition to kind of having some of the international forum, some of the international policy decisions regarding debt relief, we also needed to make sure there was domestic authority in place should there be a policy decision to do that. So we were advising policymakers on some of those issues as well. So the conflict ended up touching on a number of areas in our office.
Very helpful. Do others wish to speak to this, or should I?
I can give one other angle to it, kind of to the how to support Ukraine and folks who were right here. In ECA, they figured out that we had dozens of Ukrainian students who were here on exchange programs and were kind of stuck, couldn't really go home. The regs, our regulations that govern the exchange programs, say quite specifically, kind of what you're supposed to do and when you're supposed to go home. But there's a provision that allowed us to work with the Ukrainian embassy to come up with some temporary relief so that the students could stay, they could continue to kind of support themselves until they were able to go back home. So that's kind of again, I'm the people to people guy here. And that was a really important thing, I thought, for us to be able to do, because it really does, some things come down to the individuals.
So keeping our focus on people and, as you mentioned just a moment ago, students, let's try to get down to brass tacks to a degree. If you were to advise a law student to express an interest in working at L or contemplating a career elsewhere in the U.S. government, what kind of advice would you give? Can we start with you, Katie?
Sure. So I think there's sort of two parts to that. One, what can you do to set yourself up for success? And two, what should you be thinking about as you try and assess whether it's the right fit for you? In terms of setting yourself up for success, I think if you're possibly interested in going this direction, generally a good idea to be looking for public international law courses. I mean, at least a basic class in that, but your law school may offer more. And so pursuing those as they're available. I think for L specifically, we're a very advisory focused practice. We definitely do litigation, but a big part of what we do is advice. And so when you're looking for opportunities to build your skills, I wouldn't think just about what you're going to use, maybe the more classic legal skills of writing a legal memo or litigating. I would also think about how can you find opportunities that will let you practice conveying legal advice to people who may not be lawyers, or responding in quick turn sort of situations to needs for legal advice. So sometimes that could look like finding a clinic. Sometimes that could look like finding some sort of student practice organization at your law school. Sometimes that could look like finding an internship or an externship. But I think looking for something that will really give you opportunities to practice in that space is useful. And then just on the thinking about whether it's the right thing for you, definitely use law school if you're still there to try as many opportunities as you can. Even if something doesn't feel like it's the right fit, you'll have learned something from trying it and be better off for it. I would say if you're thinking about L, as others have said, it's a really collaborative experience. I think people who thrive in that space are going to enjoy it. The colleagues are just really, really brilliant, but unostentatious about it. And so someone who's willing to roll up their sleeves and dive in, I think that's important. Generalists, people who are going to be happy to do something and really become the expert in it, but then move on to something else. That's another part of figuring out whether it's the right fit for you. And then I would say if you're looking for something that's going to feel like it's both intellectually interesting, but practically relevant, that's kind of the sweet spot of where L operates. So I think if something like that feels like it's the right fit for you, then I would definitely encourage you to consider thinking about those first few things I mentioned and how you might end up at L.
Charlotte, can I ask if you have thoughts, Dad?
Sure. So maybe I'll focus a little bit more on sort of after you arrive in L, if you were to come, what are some good ways of thinking about your experience to set you up for success? And a couple things. One sort of touched on a bit by Katie is really to be open to a lot of different opportunities, because we are rotational. You don't necessarily control where you land at all times. And so you really do need to be open to the idea that you might spend several years doing something that you didn't necessarily think you were interested in, or wasn't your priority. I think my first 3 rotations in L were not ones that I necessarily chose. They chose me, and they all really worked out really well. I got a lot from all of them. One of the last one, which is the foreign assistance one that I spoke about, I stayed in for 5 years, and it was a fascinating experience. So being kind of open to the idea that outside of what you might have learned and what you might think, maybe you're really interested in human rights, and that's great, but you might only spend, if you came to L, you might spend 3 to 4 years on something like that. And then if you had a career, that's a lot of other years. So being open to a lot of experiences. The other thing I would say is, because we are supporting the mission of the department, our legal advice is geared towards helping the department and helping our clients achieve their goals, the mission of the department, in a way that is obviously respectful of the laws and the Constitution, but we're really there to assist them. And if you take that view to realize that your goal is to help them get where they need to be in a collaborative way, sometimes you have to be the deliverer of bad news. But if you're nice and helpful, and when they come to you, you do your best to ensure that they can reach their end goal most of the time, then when you do have to deliver bad news, they'll take it because they know that you have their interest at heart, that you're supportive of their mission. So I really, it's important to be someone who's okay with doing that, that is willing to sort of view yourself as there to help and to build your relationships with clients. They will come to you earlier, which is really to everyone's benefit, if they like you and if they know that you'll help them get where they need to be. So those are sort of, I think, help you succeed if you were to come to L.
Those are very wise reflections. And I think we have a lot of experience here of people who've worked on the recruitment committee before or chaired it. But I do want to make sure that we have the opportunity for people to ask questions. I see a microphone in the back. And so I guess we have a question being posed there.
We'd love to get started with a few students. If we have any students or young professionals who'd like to kick us off, since this event is namely for you guys. First.
Thank you for the wonderful experiences and your speech on your work experience. I'm Amit from George Washington. I have 2 questions. Basically, I take the benefit of first mic. So first is, what is happening with the appellate body at WTO? And second, appellate body at WTO. And second is related to how is your experience as women working for a State Department? I'm not sure Trent can help us here, but yeah, I would be happy to.
I feel like I should start because I'm a woman and I work on trade. I don't have an answer for you though on the appellate body at the WTO. I mean, I think, if we were in the government, I would just loop in USTR colleagues to the email or something like that. But I can't do that here. So, but unfortunately, I don't really have a satisfactory response on that front. It is just, I think, in a sort of, a sort of stasis at the moment. In terms of being a woman, it's a great question. It's something I've thought about a lot over over time. I mean, I think one thing I will say about Elle that I do very much appreciate, and I'm sure there are things we get right and there are things we get wrong, and it's always a work in progress. And having been on the recruitment committee, we are always very focused on diversity and inclusivity and trying to be better about addressing those issues. One thing I will say that I really appreciate about Elle that sets a tone that I really appreciated is that we have a lot of women that have been promoted over the years. We've had women the entire time I've been in Elle, we've had women in the front office. And that includes women who have young children. So that's, something that I noticed. And I have a young child myself. And so was something that I think there are other jobs I've had where I would have assumed I should not apply because I wouldn't be able to handle it. And I didn't feel that way here. So I think that's a positive thing. But it's always hard. I mean, some of the things I struggle with are maybe not even specific to Elle, but just like, sort of being really comfortable taking an assertive posture, being in a meeting with people that are older and that are men and having to be the one that's going to tell you, no, I'm sorry, but that is what the law says, actually. Some of those things are things that are just, they're societal. But I don't think that Elle is I don't think Elle has discouraged me in that regard. So that's good. I was going to make one more point, but I can't recall. So stop there.
I want to just add one quick thing on the sort of on the ability of, women's issues in the workplace are obviously broader than family-friendly matters, but that is also a factor. And I do think one thing I've always appreciated, the government isn't necessarily always the best from a family perspective. It's gotten better since we all started. They now have things like some paid leave, which is great. But Elle, I think, has always been as supportive as it can within the framework in which it operates, which is government regulation. And that has included, I think, being very open to taking parental leave. But also, I have always appreciated that my male colleagues, both at my own level, but also at senior levels, have always been very open about their own family obligations. And, they'll speak of their children and they'll say, I have to cut this meeting short because I have to pick up my kid from soccer. And I think it's really wonderful when the environment encourages that, not just from the women, but also from the men, because then it isn't about sort of a women's issue. It's for everyone. And I've always found that at Elle, and it's something I've always really appreciated.
Katie,
So much great ground has been covered. I guess the only thing I'll add is to echo that I found Elle to be a very good place to practice as a woman. I do think that in some of the rotations I've been in, a number of the policy clients have been almost universally men, just due to the nature of people in those offices. And so it sometimes can present tricky spaces in terms of how to present yourself in the way Charlotte was talking about, where people come to you and see you both as an authoritative person, but also someone they come to and trust and want to be included. And there are other spaces that can sometimes feel like people have a perspective of who's the person I want to kind of have a beer with after hours. And how do you build relationships in those circumstances can sometimes be challenging if you're not their idea of who's the person I want to have beer with. But I think Elle has been great in terms of offering a plethora of people to talk those issues through with when I've kind of struggled to figure out what is going to work here, what is reflective of me, but also going to make me effective in counseling clients. There have been a number of people who've been willing to step up and talk to me about what's worked for them. And maybe I won't duplicate that exactly, but it gets you started thinking about what could work for you.
I'll add one little tidbit, and that is Elle is very flat. It feels very flat. There is a hierarchy that others have described, but we're all there to get the job done. And I don't think that demographics have mattered at all in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of your title. Yeah. If I know the answer, my deputy is going to say, tell them what the answer is. And that's what it feels like. And in that way, it's a very good place to work. Yeah.
It's just before I open it up fully.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a quick question. I am an international student, and I was wondering whether the U.S. citizenship is needed to work at the State Department.
Yes. Yeah. In the position you have needed a top secret clearance, I guess is the issue.
We have people who are dual citizens, State Department, including in the legal advisor's office, but we do need a U.S. citizen.
Hi, I don't know if this is too loud. I'm Sean. I'm a 3L at Georgetown, and I'll be an intern at L next summer.
Oh, great.
So I'm extremely excited about. I was reading Harold Koh's article or speech on the 80th anniversary of L, and he emphasizes L's longstanding relationship with the academic community, including the kind of in-house role for academics. I'd love to know more about how that plays out in practice in L's daily work.
Pass the mic.
So I'm the counselor in L at the moment, and so this is a position in L that is not only, it has not exclusively been served by academics, but primarily it has been an academic position. So I am currently, due to the notional nature of our legal advisor, the only non-civil servant in the entire office, which is an interesting place to be. And the counselor has often worked on litigation and then sort of carved out for themselves things that are, sort of relevant to their own expertise. So in my case, I tend to work on use of force, law of war issues, because that has been my expertise. I actually was in L many years ago. I started my career in the Office of Legal Advisor. I worked in LPA and worked in LPM in actually a portfolio very similar to trends at the tail end of the Bush administration and the first 3 years of the Obama administration. It was an interesting time to be doing law of war and Guantanamo issues. And so for me, coming back to L, it's probably been a little bit more unique than for other counselors because I sort of cut my teeth as a government lawyer, and so but for many people, I mean, Ed could probably speak more. Did you serve with DOJ before you were?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Ed also had government experience before coming into L. It gives you an interesting sort of platform from which to return if you have a good sense of how the government works to begin with. I actually wonder how it would work if you came in whole. I think it would be a really interesting culture shock to go straight from academia into government. But it would be, fun to hear about it. Any other counselors here?
I mean, I would second everything that Beck said, and also just say it's a wonderful way that the counselor position is a wonderful way to integrate the academy into L. But also L regularly graduates, if you will, attorneys who work in the academy. Just an extraordinary number of the people who are active in public international law, and even other issues have worked in L's office. It's part, I think, the same kind of mindset, the kind of clarity of thought and the quality of writing are rewarded within L that are rewarded in the academy. And in addition, L has this advisory committee process that also regularly seeks external counsel from people outside the government, which is just a wonderful kind of two-way street for exchanging issues. And so I think of L as being deeply engaged with and conversant, to the extent it cares to, with the work of the academy.
We have time for one more question. Keep in mind that we will have a reception afterwards where you can continue to bombard our guests. Did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Shima. I'm a JD candidate at WCL. My question is, from the start of the process of application to the end, how long does it take? And what is the most challenging part of the application, individually or at whole? Thank you.
Want me to start?
Sure.
The process can take some time. so it can take, and it can be sort of relatively fast. It can be a few weeks to, it can take a few months sometimes, depending on kind of what our internal process looks like. The application process is, you send your application to an email, and then we, from that, we select candidates that we want to interview. So we have to schedule the interview, and then we consider the application as a whole following that. And so that process can take anywhere from, a month to a few months. And then there's also if you were to be given an offer, there's also the security clearance process, which then takes, quite a bit of time. In terms of what's the most difficult part about the application, I guess I would just say in a global sense, we're fortunate to have a lot of applications, but we have very few slots. And so what we're often contending with is just that sort of, limitation on how many people we can hire. I would say that's kind of the biggest challenge.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. Just a little bit more about the process as it plays out. If you kind of get through an initial stage of screening, you get brought in for interviews. So that's another challenging point for people, potentially. And then the round of interviews goes, that's sort of it in terms of the applicant usually, and we go through and consider the rest of our part of the process. So I think for applicants, there's a couple of things you can be thinking about is what can you be doing to build up that paper resume, right? Things that are going to show that you demonstrate an interest in international law, you're skilled when it comes to legal matters. But also, if you clear that first marker, be prepared to be able to talk fluently about legal issues, to be ready to offer kind of on-the-spot responses to hypothetical questions, which may be about substantive legal issues or could be more about how would you handle this tricky matter that you might have with a client, a policy client, if you were to come work here. So I think that's also an important, potentially, depending on how you approach issues, difficult part of the process.
How much is the signing bonus?
Market rate.
Oh, is that the time? So I think it is the time, am I correct, that we should proceed through?
We are exactly at time. So thank you all so much. We are going to have a reception. We'll open up these doors and we'll have drinks and snacks here. We're also going to clear out this area in the back and have some drinks and snacks in the back as well. So feel free to stick around. I know our panelists are happy to speak to you more if you have individualized questions. And we hope you'll stick around. So thanks so much.
And please join me in thanking